In this video, we're going to take a look at how to determine appropriate scale when using striped fabrics. So we have several things that we're going to need to think about. One is the scale of the doll, and then the other is the scale of the stripe on the fabric. Being that there are so many types of striped fabric, we have two different things with the stripes to think about. One is the scale or size or width of that stripe if it's just a two-color repeating stripe. And then also, if it's a set of multi-size stripes or multicolor stripes, what is the scale or the amount of the repeat between that pattern repeating on the fabric itself? I have one simple go-to rule for determining the scale for each doll type. So I just asked myself the question, how does it compare to the size of the eye or the finger? Now think about this in comparison to yourself. Look at something that you would wear, look at pictures on different websites of striped pieces on people, and you can compare them to the width and the size of your own hand. So just look at the width of your own finger. As I measure mine, I have one finger measuring just about a half an inch. I put two fingers together, it's a little bit over an inch. I have three fingers together, and that's about 2 inches. So I just scale that down when I look at the doll. So then here's her hand, and as we measure out her finger, we have just about 1/4 of an inch for one finger, or two fingers together is half inch to even almost 5/8 of an inch. And then on the smaller doll, fingers super tiny. So as we look at those, we have about 1/8 of an inch for a single finger. But then as we look at two, we're looking closer at 3/8 of an inch or so with that scale. So as we think about the scale of the stripe, then you kind of switch back and forth and you think, if I have a single stripe on my own shirt that was one finger width, that's about a half inch stripe. But on the doll, that one finger width is about 1/4 of an inch. So if you have 1/4 inch repeating stripes, then that seems pretty on scale with a two-color stripe that would repeat down the entire front of a t-shirt. Now, of course, depending on the design or your preference, or as you look at this culotte jumpsuit on the ruby red, we do have a bold wide stripe mixed in with some narrower stripes. So it's all gonna just come into your design choices and your personal preference as you put things together. A few other measurements that will be helpful in determining if the fabric overall can work for the design. If you have a repeating stripe that isn't just two colors and you need to think about how that repeat comes into play, are a few different measurements. So for the bodice, we're looking at about 3.5 inches from the neck to the waistline. On a t-shirt, it's similar for that side seam. So if you keep 3.5 inches in mind for either no repeat happening or a multiple repeat that might happen within that area, then you have that sort of in the back of your mind as you're looking. If you're thinking about the bottom half of the garment from the waist all the way down to the ankles, we're looking at something that's closer to 9 inches if it's full length, or just about 5.5 inches if it's coming to her knee. So again, just keep that in mind as you're looking at something that has a repeating element within the design. So let's take a look at some examples. Here we have a set of different width stripes. So beginning with the green and black stripe, we have a 3/8 inch width stripe that repeats. It's equal, it's a balanced stripe. This is a knit fabric. This is probably the widest stripe I would use with an 18-inch doll. It's a pretty bold size stripe in comparison to the scale of her body. Then we have a pink on pink example. This one is a nice example because it shows how you can mix things up if you turn the direction the stripe is cut with the pattern pieces. So we have a vertical stripe on the top, horizontal stripe down on the bottom. But again, these are 3/8 inch width stripes as well. It's a balanced repeating stripe design, and it works well for this type of projects. Then as we move on, we have a black and white stripe. This is a repeating balanced stripe. It's 1/8 inch wide, black and white, equal size stripes. And then we have a tinier blue and white, also balanced stripe. These are a little bit less than 1/8 inch each. So this is a tiny little stripe. It works really well. It's a nice scale for all the different doll sizes. And then finally, we have a super tiny 1/16 inch width stripe, repeating balanced stripe, yellow and white. So the two stripes together are 1/8 inch when you look at them on the measuring tape here. This is very tiny. This works really well. It's a little bit trickier to match the tiny stripes, but when you can get it done right, it looks great. Another thing you'll notice on this particular design, this is a hoodie dress and we have the front pocket cut on the diagonal. So that helps that pocket really to pop off of the front of that design. And then we have little added cuffs down at the bottom. Again, these are cut in the opposite direction. It just adds design interest to the overall look. When you're working with a fabric that has a repeating set of multi-width stripes, you have a little bit more flexibility. This really will come down to the design that you're working on and how many times that repeat is going to happen on the pattern piece, or if the repeat is going to happen at all. So in this first example, we have this fuchsia print. This is actually cut from a person's t-shirt. So this also helps understand scale a little bit. When I talked about looking at the width of my finger, these stripes in comparison to my finger, super tiny. I don't think we could ever get that small at a doll scale. If we were trying to scale down something that was about a third or maybe a sixth of the actual width of her finger, that would be a very, very narrow stripe. But for how this is a tiny stripe that actually works well for a doll t-shirt, and this one has worked well for a variety of different types of dolls. We've done it for an 18-inch doll. We've done it for a Silkstone Barbie doll. We've also done this for a Girl for All Time. We've used the same fabric, and you can see that the scale of those stripes works well with all of those designs. So as we measure out the scale of this fabric and the distance of the repeat, if you look at this largest stripe over here, and then we measure over to when that largest stripe happens again, it's just about 2 inches. So you have a 2-inch section and then a 2-inch section. So this middle section that is the wider stripes is just about 1 inch, and that is the section that you're probably going to notice the most. So you have the wide stripes, narrow stripes, wide stripes. If we were to take a pattern piece like the UK Holiday top and set it on here, you'll notice how many times this repeat is going to happen from the top of the shirt to the bottom of the shirt. So here we have fold lines at the top for the casing. So if we look at that, that would be our neckline. And then down here, we're also going to fold this up for the hemline. So as I look here, if I were to set this down a little bit and I had this first section of wide stripes, this would go right between her chest, in between her arms, but above the underarm. The side seam is starting right about here, and then we have that second repeat just below that side seam and underarm seam. It repeats one more time, and then it would repeat the fourth time right at the bottom edge of the shirt. So this amount of repeat, because these stripes are very narrow, could work well for this design. This next example, a beautiful coat, the long winter coat from Thimbles and Acorns. This one is for the 18-inch doll. And for this one, you can see on the interior, we have a very bold stripe. Now this one has the wider widths, but it also has a repeating pattern. So I think the one that you notice the most that stands out is probably this darkest stripe. It measures just about a 1/2 inch and then repeats again just about every 2.5 inches. So you have very bold stripes. Now these pieces are cut in a way where they don't repeat that often. So as they're sewn together, the stripes are not going to line up for this particular design, but it works well because it has sort of that rolling effect with the way that the skirt flares out from the bodice portion of the jacket. Here we have the Sandy Lane maxi dress. This one is done with a variation where the skirt is cut from one piece of fabric, not tiered layers. Now this one achieves almost a similar look as the tiered layers because there are so many different stripes that go across this fabric. So this overall skirt piece is just over 9 inches, and this design almost doesn't repeat at all. We have a variety of different color combinations of stripes and widths, and this does go a little bit over my maximum recommended width of that 1/2 inch stripe. These are closer to a full inch. But for this look, it's a bold, unique print, and it really works well on the overall dress design. And here's another look at a repeating stripe that's pretty far apart. This is the Union suit for 14-inch dolls. It's pretty tiny, but the overall length of this front piece is all cut as one piece. It's just about 10 inches. And if you look closely, you can see that this pattern of small stripes repeats pretty far apart. So we have this scalloped mint green color right here, and then I see that with it curving up in the same direction way up here. So here is a repeat, but as you work your way down, these are all different in between those two stripes. It's perfect for this scale, and it works great for the overall design, and you can see how with the slight angle in, they match up nicely at center front, and then also the same at center back. And then one last example, the drawstring pants that we did for our SoCal style. These were actually cut from a garment. It was a girl's full length romper, but it was exactly the stripe design and pattern that we were looking for, even though when you look at this original piece of fabric, the repeat is very wide. It goes very, very far apart. Here we have the two gold color stripes, and then way over here that happens again. So as far as a repeat, it's really far apart, and most of the pattern pieces would fall only on one section of the stripes. So when we laid out our pattern pieces, we just took time to look for something that was similar. So we have this stripe here with the two gold on the outside, and we just made sure that we had that at the front of each of the leg fronts when we cut the pieces, positioning them on the fabric one at a time, mirroring those pattern pieces. And then for this one, we turned the stripe in the opposite direction when we cut out the waistband and when we put in these little pockets on the inside, just for a little bit of added detail. Now, I mentioned earlier that a lot of the fabrics can work for the different size or scale of each doll. So here's a look at the Thimbles and Acorns dress with a satin stripe. It's woven into the fabric, and again, this is used for both dresses. So we have the 18-inch doll dress and the 14.5-inch doll dress. You can see that stripe repeating. There's 3 stripes, there's a space, there's 3 stripes. The stripes themselves are about 1/8 of an inch, and then it looks like they're about 1/4 of an inch apart, and maybe then closer to 3/4 of an inch in between each version of the repeat. But that all still works fine on both of the dresses in each size. Now, one thing that I thought would be interesting to point out is the unique interest that's added when the stripe is turned in the opposite direction for this variation of the bodice. So when the stripes come across, as opposed to being up and down, it just adds a little bit more design interest overall, and you really begin to notice the stripes. They stand out more because you're looking at them in 2 different directions. So as I've mentioned, turning the pattern pieces to cut the stripes in the opposite direction, that really leads to the question, can I do that? Can I do that for any design? So my best answer is yes, except if the design has stretch that's needed in one direction or the other. Then you're really going to need to pay attention to the fabric that you have. For these 2 swimsuits, you can see that we have the stripes going across on one and the stripes going vertically up and down on the other. Now this is a 4-way stretch, so it worked fine to position the pattern piece straight up and down or across. We could cut it out and it still has stretch in both directions. I hope this video helps to take the fear out of choosing striped fabrics for your next design project.